What if you could know for certain that a story was true, that a business partner had no ulterior motives in their dealings, that person who killed a high-ranking official was actually acting in self-defense? Everything would change. Today, let's talk about Zone of Truth and how it should impact your D&D world. Zone of Truth is a second-level enchantment that takes an action to cast. It covers a sphere with 30 feet of diameter and ensures that any creature within the zone must make a charisma saving throw against your DC or become unable to deliberately utter a lie. The caster has full knowledge of any creature that may succeed the saving throw, and in turn the creature has full knowledge of the spell itself and its effects, and can thus use avoidance or simply refuse to answer the question at all. It lasts for 10 minutes, can be cast at any point within 60 feet of the caster, and can be cast by clerics, paladins, and bards, unless you found some other way to get this spell on your list. So, a spell that can force people to tell the truth. On the surface, it sounds worrisome. However, there are clearly a few things that make this less powerful. Firstly, the target must fail the saving throw against the caster, meaning it is entirely possible to be charismatic enough or lucky enough to never really have a problem with Zone of Truth. A creature who knows what the spell does, which helpfully is any creature that is affected by it, can simply walk out of the radius as long as they're not being held there. So, it would certainly be silly to try and trick anyone with the Zone of Truth, as even them failing on the saving throw gives them full knowledge of the spell, its effects, and the fact that you've cast it. But tricks are not the primary function of this spell. It works best when your target is trapped, either by imprisonment, the legal system, or simply social obligation. So let's talk about how Zone of Truth would find common use across your D&D world, especially in the legal system, and what that would mean for the people within said worlds. Our entire legal system in modernity is built around finding and providing evidence sufficient to convince a jury of peers beyond reasonable doubt that a crime has been committed. Some of the tools used in this are direct confession, physical evidence, or character building, all of which can be used to build a case. This was not always true historically, or especially untrue in other parts of the world. Oftentimes, having divinely ordained monarchs or divinely ordained religious leaders hand down sentences was fairly commonplace throughout the history of our world. This often meant that such people were given the role of sole judge, presiding over all proceedings, and giving a singular judgment after hearing testimonies. In a world which uses Zone of Truth in its legal system, most likely by a cleric who is sworn to follow a respectable deity, who is tasked with reporting failed and successful saves to the presiding authority, with individuals likely forced to exit and re-enter the zone until they fail the save, the development of a jury would likely come later, or not at all. Evidence giving would likely be limited to about 5 minutes per side, and this only in the most difficult of cases, which would ensure that both defence and prosecution would be telling the truth the whole time. And it is likely that hesitation, or otherwise wasting the prescribed short period in which the Zone of Truth is active, would likely become its own offence, much like contempt of court is today. Wasting the precious time that this spell is active, especially as it's not castable as a ritual, would be prohibitively expensive for any court, as Even second-level spells don't come cheap to a cleric, who could be curing diseases or healing up to 6 mortally wounded people with that single spell slot. Due to this, rituals would likely have developed that govern how Zone of Truth is interacted with in a courtroom setting. First, non-verbal gestures would ease communication between the spellcaster and the presiding authority. Gestures would be used instead of words to speed things up to determine who has failed and who has succeeded on their saving throws, and who might need to re-enter again to make sure they fail. Perhaps a thumbs up if they're affected by the spell, or a thumbs down if they've resisted the spell's effects, which would likely be seen as bad form or some similar contempt of court if your table plays with the rule that you can intentionally fail saving throws. If you can't choose to fail, perhaps specific rules exist for characters with classes, especially paladins, who may literally be unable to fail a low-level casting of Zone of Truth. Once snared by the spell, the presiding officer would likely read a list of pre-prepared questions which will expect responses from the individual under a Zone of Truth. These will either be probably fewer than 5, administered by a short sand timer, or significantly more questions designed to be answered with a quick yes or no for maximal efficiency. This would likely function similarly to a modern cross-examination, and may well be fertile ground for very lawyery wordings, giving very, very little wriggle room, meaning that the question asking may take up a significant portion of the Zone of Truth's time. Questions would most likely need to be pre-approved by the court official, to ensure that the wordings are not too confusing or too obtuse for a reasonable person to understand what they're saying in response, and to make sure that such things are not left open to interpretation, even after this expensive resource is spent. There is also a strong likelihood that investigators would actually just supply folks a series of statements to repeat back, which have also been pre-vetted to ensure that no weaseling is possible in determining the actual truth. If the statement is not repeated fully and correctly, the individual is hiding at least something. After all, they cannot lie. For example, the prosecutor instructs the accused to repeat after me. I did not kill Mr. Wilson. I have no knowledge of the killers or killer of Mr. Wilson, and have had no knowing contact with said killer or killers. I have in no way contributed to Mr. Wilson's death, disadvantage, or harm, up to and including plotting, recommending, or paying for any of the above. I have no further undisclosed information that may be of interest to this court. Now that is not fully watertight, but I can imagine it might be a very good thing for someone's defence if they can say that entire statement under the effects of a Zone of Truth. At the end of the day, a legal system that relies on Zone of Truth is an inflexible one. Whether it is used in a courtroom setting, an interrogation, which would be especially useful if victims or witnesses are no longer available for comment, or in establishing the facts of a case, information gathered through Zone of Truth would likely be assumed infallible, much like what happened with DNA evidence in our modern world. Court officials could easily and understandably begin to overestimate the value of a Zone of Truth confession, meaning anyone who avoids questions or even fails to respond with immediacy may be put under immediate suspicion. As we see in the almost completely useless polygraph tests that are often taken in America, nervousness or apprehension when taking the test can often be read by the interpreter as a sign of guilt. Furthermore, in a world potentially without a full understanding of the workings of personal memory and its surprising unreliability, misremembering may not be counted as a deliberate lie. In our world, people misremember and misidentify criminals at a rather alarming rate, and witness testimony often varies significantly depending on personal perception and our own misremembering of our own memories, as our memories are edited each time we try and access them by our own minds. Certainly, a surefire lie detection method would be snapped up by all judicial systems on Earth and in your fantasy world. But when people can easily be manipulated or manipulate themselves into remembering completely invented memories, and two people's perceived truth of memory can differ wildly, such a system would be ripe for abuse. Contradictions would likely be swept under the rug. Zone of Truth would still be hailed as infallible. And it is likely that Zone of Truth itself, and those who cast it, would most likely begin to use it as a political tool. Experienced nobility, with access to some knowledge about the malleability and subjectivity of truth and memory, and training in rhetoric, would likely answer questions under stress much, much better than, let's say, a nervous blacksmith, who's never seen the inside of a court, who is far more likely to hesitate, stammer, and be far more nervous in creating perfect responses in his mind to the prosecution's questions. So much so that this nervousness or hesitation or diligence to get it exactly right may prove his downfall in one of the common sense laws earlier. A time-wasting law, a hesitation law, or perhaps an assumption that he is guilty because he is taking a while and being very careful about his answers. This may even be enough for a full conviction. Now, let's talk about where Zone of Truth actively fails. Firstly, the only way to tell it is functional is to be the person who cast it. This means that your presiding authority should really be the one to cast the Zone of Truth, or at least have a magic item that allows them to do so. A magic item which would certainly be extremely popular if it properly existed. The closest you'll get in 5e is either a magic gavel from Storm King's Thunder, or a truth serum, which is listed as equipment, which would require a medical professional to ensure that the individual who has taken the truth serum is actually affected by its poisoned condition. Otherwise, you may run the risk of a biased or lying cleric or bard muddying the water. Even a god of a trustworthy deity can have a bad day, have a personal vendetta, or even go against the law at his god's urging. Furthermore, while someone may well be punished for failing or refusing to speak, it would be deeply totalitarian to judge them immediately as guilty for that, meaning that any civilized nation will really have to deal with the possibility that people simply won't talk under a Zone of Truth, no matter how much punishment you give them, if the crime that they're facing otherwise is bad enough. Zone of Truth is also entirely negated by the admittedly high-level spell Modify Memory, and that's even if we assume memory to be reliable in the first place. This could easily lead to false convictions, and any Rakshasa that finds themselves wandering into a Zone of Truth will have an awful lot of fun, considering it is immune to the spell's effects, a fact which it is not clear if the caster even knows. The Rakshasa may make a saving throw regardless, at its own whim, informing the caster that it cannot possibly tell a lie. And this is all, of course, without getting into the difficult and messy interpretation of what a deliberate lie actually means. Suffice it to say, this spell and its application can get very messy. Suffice it to say, this spell and its application can get very messy. It's all well and good to talk about memory, conjecture, and lies, but many people forget that Zone of Truth can actually be used as a preventative tool as well, a precaution. It is likely that clerics would also be hired or commissioned, perhaps for a hefty donation to their church, to act as deal brokers for major transactions. In a world where it's a little more difficult to find out if your potential business partner has shady dealings, past bankruptcies, or a false persona under their belts, a definitively truthful statement can go an awfully long way. Suddenly, your shadowy prospective business partner is forced to state, "I am part of no competing business ventures. I have no designs on co-opting this venture, and intend, to the best of my ability, to fulfill all aspects of our professional contract. I am engaging in this venture of my own will, and I seek a profitable and fruitful business partnership with yourself." Now imagine a mob boss making his initiates make a similar oath, paying a local bard just to make sure everybody's being truthful. It will make it far more difficult to be a mole, especially if there's this whole social presumption of guilt in refusing to speak under a zone of truth. I might actually suggest that in criminal elements, it's far more likely that this social presumption of guilt would actually occur, most likely leading to a set of entirely truthful, if utterly paranoid, individuals working together in a close-knit community, most likely partially controlled by the one who casts the spell. It would also likely be considered foolish for a nation to sign or engage in treaty talks without at some point using the zone of truth. Whether that's in the discussion of intentions, assets, or indeed in securing certain truthful promises. It is very likely in your world that verbal contracts accompany written contracts. A written treaty may be legally binding, but a verbal contract witnessed by a zone of truth indicates a clear commitment from present officials to upholding the deal, and sets both sides' minds at ease. If you haven't developed a god of truth for your world, or indeed several, depending on pantheon, alignment, and characteristic, it may be wise to consider doing just that. You see, the biggest issue with any spell whose confirmatory effects are limited to just one or two individuals is that you've got to have some way to trust those individuals, especially if you're employing them to cast the spell. This is, of course, barring any silly solutions like a complex Venn diagram of zones of truth, to make sure everyone's telling the truth to each other in a complex set of watchwords and oaths, to make sure that all of the people in the Venn diagram know that they're all telling the truth. I mean, that probably takes about 10 minutes anyway, rendering the whole thing moot. As such, an administrative body would probably need to be formed to witness and observe any events that require a zone of truth, one which is free from bias, free from bribery, and even beyond traditional structures of governments, nations, or companies. Yes, you could still receive a zone of truth from your local high priest, but for an added fee. It is likely that you'd be able to hire an independent confessor from the cult of truth. These individuals would be famed for their discretion, their devotion to the goals of their god, and their international reach. A confessor would likely have some degree of diplomatic immunity, and would be called in whenever two parties who are having a disagreement could not agree on one single neutral third party. This kind of generic framework for an organisation is taken from my own fantasy world, and they are mostly used by private individuals and in international relations. When any old priest can be bribed by any old person to skew the results of a zone of truth, having an organisation like this just makes sense, especially when you consider that any event that is said to be officiated by a confessor would gain an additional layer of legitimacy, especially if you make this cult kinda spooky, as I do in my world. There are 3 logical endpoints to using Zone of Truth as your primary method of truth collection, be you a nation, an organisation, or a legal system. The first would become evident the more often Zone of Truth is used, especially on multiple individuals. The truth is malleable and relative. As mentioned before, our memory is deeply imperfect, and witness testimony is not exceptionally reliable, due in part to our constant rewriting of our own memories, and in part due to implicit biases. It is possible that a mass adoption of Zone of Truth and study of Zone of Truth could speed up a mass adoption of subjective understandings of truth as evidence, even when compared with our own world, especially with the wrinkle of deliberate lies thrown in. It is entirely possible that a reasonable judicial system may regard evidence gained from Zone of Truth as just another building block of a wider case, and not a de facto truth or lie. It could still lead to the development of a jury system to make sure that this was checked and balanced. And in some civilized democracies, which may exist in your world, Zone of Truth could even be seen as a rather backwards and ham-fisted method of finding the truth and gaining judgment, used by hedge priests, witch finders, and people who operate quick and dirty courts out in the rural sticks. It may even eventually receive a reputation only slightly better than the polygraph test itself. Of course, this assumes a relatively benevolent system capable of addressing its own systemic faults and structural biases, also capable of moving past appeals to authority, which would be common when the people casting the spell are most likely clerics of well-respected gods. It is possible, but would require a great deal of effort and a collective interest in social justice. So should be saved really for groups of academics, philosophers and social thinkers in relatively small circles, and perhaps a nation or two that has an incredibly strong sense of civic justice. Maybe your republics or things of that description. A darker path, I feel, is most likely. This has been the assumed state throughout this video. A court system where Zone of Truth is used as a political tool to silence unsavoury characters. A tool that nonetheless functions to force confessions, assuming the criminal in question is under duress, torture, or any other threat of serious harm. Or if they're fed answers specifically crafted to confirm his guilt or innocence. Career prosecutors would be likened to devils in your world, for their meticulous and careful crafting of words that can catch even the most hardened of criminals out in a lie. And any discrepancies in testimony would simply be swept under the rug. After all, with only 10 minutes of this spell's activation, why spend all of that time establishing a full picture of the scene with multiple witness testimonies when you could just ask the guy if he did it? It's not like he can lie. Such systems would likely have short cases ruled in a way that reflects the ancient Near East. 2 petitioners come before the monarch, plead their cases, and the monarch passes judgment. Perhaps if the ruler is busy or we have a decentralised judicial system, a judge may be appointed. It is very likely that in such courts, not answering would be tantamount to guilt, and unsavoury priests would find themselves with an excellent career option, either siding with the justice system itself to shuffle prosecutions in a way that suits them, or by accepting hefty bribes from wronged parties to make sure that the other guy gets punished. This is also likely the way Zone of Truth is perceived by most people in your world, from gangs to merchants. It is a method of getting answers from specific individuals either before or after suspected wrongdoing, partly as a preventative measure, partly as a way to redress wrongs, and partly as a way to keep an in-group secure and on the same page. I would expect most cultures in a D&D world to reflect some of the superstitions I've discussed, from assuming slow or hesitant answers are somewhat fraudulent, to political speeches, often taking longer than 10 minutes, to an automatic suspicion for anyone who hides their hands during the entirety of a questioning, making sure they're not a rakshasa. It would really have significant impact on the running of society and some of the cultural norms that become apparent in your world. The third potential consequence of relying on Zone of Truth is slightly absurdist, but can certainly present an interesting case, especially if it's adopted by, say, one nation in your entire world. The thing about Zone of Truth is if you have the person under enough pressure and duress, you can at least force them to answer. If you're an authoritarian regime, this is your dream. You have 10 minutes in which to find evidence of a person's fallibility under torture, threat, or potentially worse. This means that after you run through a list of criminal acts that they have to deny ever doing, you may then feel it fair to then move on to moral failings. Why not, after all? If there's something wrong with a person, it's best to know early, before they can act upon it. The first time a person was caught planning to commit a murder, who hadn't done it yet, would indeed be a watershed moment for this sort of a culture. Or perhaps a serial killer is caught by some random screening, keeping the streets safe, they'd call it. Anyone else would call it an incredibly stifled, authoritarian state. Detect thoughts? Zone of Truth? The main concern would not be that people may be imprisoned based on flimsy evidence. No. Much worse. The authorities would brag that they can actually find criminals before they commit their criminal acts. And why wouldn't the populace believe them? After all, the authorities say it's true. And it's a bad idea to harbour doubts about what they tell you. This situation can of course only occur in a space which can devolve into authoritarianism, with a large enough and a physically centralised enough population to actually effectively control. It is also likely that this sort of place would have a significant cult of clerics associated with its particular authoritarian ruler, to provide a steady stream of clerics and paladins roaming the streets, searching to find dissidents and criminals. But with the right setup, it's not infeasible. World building is complex and requires you to spiral out from a starting point. All of these three scenarios could happen as a result of over-relying upon Zone of Truth, and they could even all occur in the same world. I hope this helps you think about the impact of your spells, even those that are just second level. If you've enjoyed this look at what a single spell can do for your world building, please subscribe to the channel. I want to build a community of people who are really interested in this stuff, and sound off in the comments if you think I've missed anything or you've got anything to add to this really interesting topic. If you'd like to see more, also let me know down there. But for now, thank you for watching. I've been Tom, otherwise known as the Grungeon Master, and I will see you in the next video.